Maybe I'm blinded by a vision of you. And baby, it's hard to know what to do.
And the barrel, like, are they, do French oak barrels last longer than American oak, or is it the opposite? Or
No, nothing like that. French and American barrels are different because they have different sort of grain, tightness of grain. American barrels have, generally speaking, a looser grain or a not as tight grain, and therefore they have a lot more sap in them. They tend to be a little more, they tend to add a little bit more of that woody character as opposed to the things that are in barrels like vanillin and toast and oak. Yeah, American oak, all it does is it tends to be a little bit more bold flavors in the wine, whereas French oak tends to be a tighter grain and tends to lend a little more delicate flavors maybe to the wine as well.
Sometimes you get like a smoky flavor in wine, and even in Pinot Noirs you can get that smokiness. Is that from, would you say, American oak then?
No, that smokiness comes more from the toasting of the barrels.
Oh, okay.
When we choose our barrels, we have a choice of no toast whatsoever, meaning that when they're making the barrels, they don't burn the inside of the barrel. They don't toast it. So it would be a no toast barrel, which virtually nobody would use at this stage anyway. And then it goes anywhere from a light toast through a medium toast to a medium plus toast and a heavy toast. And that toastiness in the flavor of the wine comes from that part of the barrel process. So this is called punching down.
Okay.
Punching down the cap, and this is the same principle that we would do if the wine was in a tank, or if it was in a smaller container like this, a bin. And basically, the whole premise of the procedure is to get the cap wet. The cap is all the skins that have come to the top of the tank during fermentation. Yeast in the process of fermentation create a lot of CO2 and a lot of heat. And that CO2 pushes the skins up to the top surface of the wine. And what we want to do is we want to get those skins, which contain all the color and all of the flavors and the tannins and that sort of thing, back into the juice, so kind of like a tea steeping. And so we want to do that, but we also want to get the cap wet, submerged in the wine, and get it wet so that you don't have a place where fruit flies and different insects that carry different bacteria can form on the top and create volatile acidity on the top. So that's the reason why we're doing this. So what I'm doing here is called a punch down. En français, is a pigeage.
Pigeage. And is the best way to do it manual like this, or do people use machines, or is
people use machines. People have been trying to develop new techniques for cap management for decades, really. Probably the most efficient ways are the mechanical ways. The mechanical ways would be like things like roto-fermenters, which are a tank like this, but laying on its side, and it turns on an axis. And inside that tank, the skins are constantly being reincorporated into the wine. So that tank would turn, a couple of times every hour or 2 hours to keep submerging the cap. And so that's one method. Another method is a Ganymede tank, which what it does is during the course of fermentation, I said CO2 builds up. It builds up inside to the top of the tank, and then there's a little valve that releases every couple of hours and shoots it all down to the bottom of the tank, into the bottom of the tank, and then that rushes up and breaks up that motion breaks up the cap, just like if you had a boiling pot of stew or something. So it's the same type of concept. So those go on all the time, 24 hours a day. This stuff only happens when we have to work, or when we work. So
When you want to
we
work.
try to do cap management once or twice a day. There are some places that have 24-hour crews working that would have 4 and 5 cap management procedures during the daytime, or during the day and night. In a place like us where there's just myself and Andrew, we would be doing cap management once a day probably with pump overs and then punch downs like this.
Yeah. Like check this out. Check this out. This is completely, having been broken. This is completely like soft and whatnot, right? Now compare that to the cap pre-punched. What it gets like. This is totally dry, very solid. Like it's like a giant sponge almost. Like as you can tell, there's no liquid under here, like to as deep as my hand at least. So when you're using a punch down tool like that, you have to push down with pretty much all your weight at first to start breaking the cap. Once you make a little spot in the middle, it gets really easy. But this is what forms, and so you can see why. Like this is not a mixture of wine and skins at all. This is just skins on top. Why we have to reincorporate this? I just wanted to play the skins.
Nice.
Well, one of the things that's really important too with us as winemakers is you've got to get your hands into the wine during the process. You've got to, if you can't touch the wine, you can't touch the grapes, then you're too far removed. I like to know what's happening at all times. If I had my way, I would have all small bins like this, no tanks for fermentation, just all bins like this so that I could get my hands into the wine, smell the grapes, smell to see if there's any vinegar smells or off smells. And also you can dig down deep into the cap. You can see that there's fermentation going on. You see how it's bubbling like that? The yeast is creating fermentation or creating gas. Okay, so that happens deep down in there. You can't see that if it's inside of a tank. So you want to get in there and you want to get your hand in there and you can feel a little temperature. Normally we would take thermometer readings of the wine to make sure it's not fermenting at a too hot a rate. But this way, if we're just getting our hands in there, we can say, oh geez, that's getting pretty warm. We better do a temperature reading and make sure that it's not overheating, because you don't want to cook the grapes. You don't want it to be like a stew, using that analogy, and actually cook the grapes, because it gives different types of flavors to the wine. You want to keep the wine the fermentation as cool as possible. So I don't know if you want to put your hand over here, nice and clean hand. You can put your hand in the wine. You can feel there's some warmth.
It's warm, yeah.
Warmth there, yeah.
Right.
These have already cooled down. When they first started fermenting, they were warm like bath water almost.
Yeah.
Well, we always hear people and they're talking about doing cold soaks.
Yeah.
And is that like similar to what we're doing here? Is that
A cold soak is actually done before fermentation.
right?
So once the grapes come in from the field, they would be put into a tank that has a glycol jacket on it, or they would put into a cold room, for instance. For me, I've only got a cold room. So I would take these bins that come in from the field, put them in a cold room, and let them sit there for a couple days, and they would get the juice the skins as they break release all the juice, so you get a little bit of liquid forming inside the bin, and all of that liquid comes in contact with the skins. So not only do you get the color coming out of the skins, but you get a lot of the wild yeasts that are that have formed on the grapes. You get those starting to do the work for you. So fermentation actually starts with the wild yeasts going. And some people like to continue the fermentation with wild yeasts and completely finish it. And some people like to start it with wild fermentation and finish it off with a manufactured yeast or a what's the word I'm looking for? Cultured yeast. So that's kind of the concept of the cold soak. It's more just a cold maceration period before the fermentation starts. The cold, what we do is what is called a cold press on the grapes. Some winemakers will, while the grapes are fermenting like this, well, it's really hot like this, they'll do a press on the grapes, removing the skins from that. So all you're getting is the wine that's 3/4 or half fermented, and then they'll take those and they'll put them in the tank and then eventually in a barrel and finish off the fermentation that way. But they're fermenting it while it's hot, while the juice is still hot or the wine is still hot. Whereas with the procedure I do is called a cold press, and that's once the fermentation's completely stopped and the cap starts to sink, so all the CO2 is finishing or has escaped, and the yeast have stopped working and they've died, they all sink to the bottom of the tank, the skins start to sink back through the tank. Then I take that wine and that must and pump it into the tank, or into the press I should say, and do what's called a cold press. So you're pressing out everything after the entire course of fermentation. So in those final stages of that wine sitting in tank with all the skins, it's like a soup sitting on the stove. You turn it off and you let it sit. It still keeps going and still keeps going, but the flavors keep intensifying, and that's what happens when the fermentation is finishing like this.
Nice.
So basically, what I'm getting is an extended maceration period where you're pulling out lots of color. All the wines we have here at Marynissen are very dark, deep color. It tends to draw out more of the tannins, the natural tannins inside the grape skins. And you get that in the wine, so the wine has a lot more ageability to it. And it just gives another whole new dimension to the wine. It makes it a little bit more, mostly more ageable than anything else.